Welcome to the Get Real Podcast, your high-octane boost of full-on reality therapy for personal, business, and investing success with your host, Ron Phillips, because somebody's got to tell it like it is.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Get Real Podcast. Ron Phillips, Heather Marchant here. We have another show for you today that was a request. Man, we're super excited about you participating in the show. The show is all about you anyway, so we love it when you ask us for a specific show. Today, we have that show. Now, when you ask for things that venture outside of Heather and I's expertise, we have to go into the network. And it just so happens that I know the guy for this particular question. Welcome to the show, Bob Bluhm. Bob is an attorney, and he specializes in asset protection, company formation, all of the structure that you need for no matter how simple or how complicated your business becomes. Bob is the guy in the industry to help you stay. He has helped me many times. Stay out of trouble up front is the best way to do it. Bob, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you, Ron. Pleasure to be here.
Bob, I should say that if I remember your story correctly, you used to be the guy that went after people's assets. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's
Really?
right. I was a trial lawyer for many. Oh, yes, and had many cases in the courtroom, and completely switched sides after one particular case that should have gone. We should have lost the case, but we ended up winning because of a tactic. That the plaintiff's lawyer made a mistake about. We took advantage of it, but we won the case, and it was just wrong. We shouldn't have won the case, and that made me really do a lot of soul searching. And I ended up switching sides and becoming an asset protection attorney as a result.
Fascinating.
Yeah,
that's really cool.
So I wanted to make sure that story got in here because that's why Bob is the guy. Right. So we're going to talk about today, and the one niche that we're going to talk about today is only a small part of what Bob does. But when we got the question, I was like, I know literally the guy who does this. He does this all the time and helps people. And that question is, Heather?
Well, the question was, how do I purchase properties outside when I live outside the country? Sometimes people that live outside the country are citizens of the United States, but most of the time they're not. And when I came to Ron with this idea, I did a ton of research. I was trying to be the expert. And so I was so glad when Ron said, I actually have someone who's an expert, because I was like, hallelujah, because there's a lot to know and do. And so super happy to have you be able to answer this question and not us.
Good. So glad, Bob. You can't even understand how glad we are. So walk us through this, Bob. You do this all the time. I know it's not a huge part of your practice, but it is you do more of these, I think, than anybody else I know who does what you do. Walk us through kind of the process, and then let's talk about the pros and cons for folks outside of the country, because we have some listeners who are outside the country, and we probably have some people who know folks who are outside of the country who would like to invest in America as well. So,
Sure. Well, one of the, I think you mentioned pros and cons. One of the big pros is the prices in the U.S. compared to many, many countries are very attractive. And to foreign investors, I represent a lot of Canadians who invest in the U.S., but also people from literally all over the world. I've got clients in Japan, Singapore, the U.K., Italy, people who do speak English. I'm not multilingual, but as long as they speak English, I can help them. We have clients in Central South America. We have, literally clients all over the world, Australia, New Zealand. And so these are people I admire hugely because they see a task that is daunting to most people, but they figure it out and they go forward. So they are able to invest in U.S. Real estate through many different ways, either tax liens, tax deeds, outright buying properties, renovating properties, wholesaling properties, buying short-term, mid-term rentals. It runs the gamut, and multifamily properties in addition to commercial. So all the different asset classes these investors from all over the world are interested in. and they come through, they do it. So some of the hurdles that they find are the logistical, the bureaucratic red tape that drives everybody crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we help them with. We cut through the red tape and make it cleaner and easier for them.
That's really cool.
Bob and I, just before the show, we're talking about red tape. Listen, you're not alone if you're a foreigner and there's red tape, because there's red tape for us too. Would be a government that's an appropriate government if they just didn't red tape the crap out of everybody. Ours is no exception to that. So I live in Canada. I want to buy a property in, Kansas City, Missouri. What do I need to do, Bob, to make this happen?
Well, you need offense and defense. Let's put it that way. You need a plan, a strategy for how you're going to acquire the property. That is not my area. I'm on the defense side. But somebody who's going to acquire property really ought to have some kind of coaching, some kind of team behind them to help them walk through the offense side, the purchase side of things. It really helps. I work with a number of organizations in Canada who do exactly that, and they're great at it. They have typically teams on the ground in a particular area. They've got realtors, they've got appraisers, they've got home inspectors, they've got rehabbers, they've got construction crews ready to go, and they even have financing in some cases. So it makes it so much easier on the acquisition side of things. But part of the acquisition side is, how are you going to own the property? What are you going to do with the property once you have it? And that's where our team comes in, because we are lawyers, and we then set up the structure that a foreign investor is going to need to protect themselves from U.S. liability and to be tax efficient. And particularly for Canadians with two different tax systems, the interplay between those two systems can really trip you up. We have to use a very particular structure, which is a limited partnership structure, in order to avoid double taxation, because otherwise a Canadian would be double taxed. And let's face it, paying one tax is bad enough. Paying twice is even worse. So we eliminate double taxation.
I don't know a whole lot about what's going on in Canada, but if it's anything like the U.S., when you give them your money, they just piss it away anyway. So why not keep as much of it as you can? And certainly, so how does that work, Bob? Are they paying, if you set up the structure right, are they paying just Canadian taxes and not American taxes, or is it the vice versa?
Well, it's interesting. They pay actually a little bit of both. So just as an example, let's say somebody earns $100,000 in the U.S. They live in Canada, and Canadian law will state that a Canadian resident is required to pay Canadian taxes on worldwide income. So they have to report the $100,000 they earned in the U.S. to the CRA, the Canadian Revenue Agency, and pay Canadian taxes on that money. And that's understandable and no problem. But the problem arises when the IRS steps in and says, well, look, if you earn money in the U.S., you also have to pay U.S. income taxes on that same $100,000. Mm-hmm. That's double taxation. And so we set up the only structure really that's going to eliminate double taxation, and that is a limited partnership, which now qualifies under the Canada-U.S. tax treaty for a tax credit. And it's technically called a foreign tax credit. And basically what that means is, just to put some made up numbers to it, if somebody earned $100,000 in the U.S. and let's say paid $20,000 of U.S. income taxes, they still report the $100,000 to the CRA, and they get a $20,000 credit against any taxes owed in Canada on their U.S. earnings. That is the foreign tax credit. And we set up the correct structure so they're able to have that foreign tax credit and avoid double taxation.
Very cool. Very cool.
Wow.
Okay. So two governments are still going to waste their money. It's just less of it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I just want to make sure, because I can just tell you, those of you who live in Canada, that when you pay your money to the U.S. government, we will waste it here. Absolutely. But since you're paying less, that's good. That's good. I hope they waste it on something that I like. I mean, you never can tell what they're going to waste it on, but they'll
more hockey stadiums. How's that?
Yeah, I mean that's a good use of funds, in my opinion.
That's right.
Yeah, we don't need any more studies about studies in the U.S.
Right.
But
one of the things, Ron, that people really ought to be aware of is that the common U.S. structures, which would be an LLC, don't work. for a Canadian in particular. And the reason is an LLC does not qualify for a foreign tax credit under the Canada-U.S. tax treaty and will result in double taxation. So, a lot of these organizations that really don't quite understand will say, well, let's just set up an LLC. A U.S. realtor will say, well, to a Canadian, just set up an LLC. You'll be fine. Looking only at the liability protection side of things, yeah, that'll protect you from liability, but it'll also result in double taxation.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting because the research I was doing, everybody was saying an LLC. That's interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why
glad you came.
The guy, Heather. You call the guy.
So how do they go about paying taxes as a foreigner? Like, how do they set that up to be done through the proper channels, I guess?
Well, and that brings to mind, one of the bad or ugly sides of things. And that is, of course, anybody in business should have an accountant. And in Canada, they should have a good Canadian chartered accountant. But because they're earning income in the U.S. and they're going to have to pay U.S. income taxes, they're also going to have to file a U.S. tax return. So they're going to need a U.S. CPA to do that for them. And one of the things that we do is we connect them with great Canadian accountants, great U.S. CPAs who can handle that task. So they're covered on both sides of the border. And these groups that we connect them with understand the cross-border implications of taxes, and they work hand in hand. They work together. And some are even cross-border accountants themselves where they are qualified in both Canada and the U.S. You get, cool. Two packages in one.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have to have, because you don't have a social security number when I file taxes, right? That goes on there. So how do they file as a foreign citizen?
Good question, Heather. Great question. They have.
It's early for Heather right now, but she's coming in hot this morning. So
they're very good. They'll have the equivalent of a social security number, which is a taxpayer identification number, which is also called an ITIN or TIN. And that is applied for to the IRS, and it takes forever to get, just like anything with the IRS. And but that is the equivalent that goes on their tax return in the U.S. The ITIN. Also,
so they should probably do that first.
Well, that's something. But the good news is the Canadian accountants we connect them with have an expedited process for getting that. So it really helps. To do that on your own would make you nuts. But to have a professional helping you makes it so much easier. One of the other things that has to happen is they have to get an EIN or a taxpayer identification number for each one of the entities that are set up in the U.S. And for a U.S. person, it's really easy. We go online in 5 minutes. We've got an EIN. Yeah. For someone who is foreign, we have to fax it in to the IRS. Believe it or not, they don't have email. It's still faxes. I'm sure.
So listen.
Oh yeah.
I mean, what?
Yeah, they're using vacuum tubes still.
I don't understand. We just didn't they just pass billions of dollars to hire like a gazillion more agents? Why not do some infrastructure? I mean,
in that bill, Ron, $80 billion was going to the IRS. Now, fortunately, the Republicans in Congress clawed back $20 billion, so they're only going to get net $60 billion. But only $5 billion of that, of the $80 billion, was designated for improved customer service, if you can believe it. So,
I believe it. It's it shouldn't be believable, but I believe it.
Sad to say.
So listen, if you're a Canadian or any other nationality other than the United States, and you're trying to invest here, we just apologize up front for the atrocious customers. Can we call it customer service? What do you call the opposite of customer service? Yeah. They haven't earned the right to even have the label of customer service department. They don't have customer service there. They have I'll think of what it is before the end of the show.
More like customer abuse, something like that.
That's it. Yeah. And are we really customers? I'm not sure we're customers either. I think
are we more victims?
Yeah, mandatory customers.
Indentured servant abuse.
Yeah.
Something. Okay. Sorry, Bob. All right, so you get the TIN number, then you also have to get an EIN number, which
That's right.
takes forever.
And unfortunately, those take time because once again, we'll fax it into the IRS. We'll call them later. They'll say, well, we never got it. Of course they did. They lost it, and we do it over and over again. It can take 4 to 6 to 8 weeks. It's just it's a maze.
I'm
it's
picturing the old fax machine that has those rolls,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, if you're Gen Z, you probably don't know what I'm talking about right now. But the fax machine was, first off, they probably don't know what a fax machine is. Anyway, a fax machine is before email, right? We used to like send things through a machine and it would print out on the other side. But the original ones of these had these roller papers. And when you got to the end of the roll, the paper was wound so tight that when it came off of the printer, it would fall down and roll under the little printer stand. And that's what Bob is talking about. Clearly, what is happening here is that yours rolled off and went under the printer machine. That's what happened. So, all right.
Sad to
That's
say.
crazy. That is
Oh boy. Okay. So go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was going to just say, we were talking about the good, bad, and ugly. The good is that the opportunities in the U.S. are tremendous in comparison to real estate prices in most other developed countries.
Yeah,
sure. Canada is facing a terrible housing shortage. We have a housing shortage in the U.S. too, but nothing like Canada. And then other countries experience this as well. But the housing prices in the U.S. are really a bargain in comparison. And foreign investors often just can't believe that that's real, but it is. As you well know, you're in the real estate business yourself. One of the other challenges for a Canadian or a foreign investor is getting financing. And a lot of times Canadians just in general are accustomed to only the 6 big national banks in Canada. But in the U.S., they're astonished to hear that we have thousands of banks and we have different levels of banks. We have national banks, we have regional banks, we have state level banks, we have community banks, we have, credit unions, and all of these are lending institutions. And then sometimes I get a question that doesn't make any sense. They say, well, are they safe? Are they going to go under? Well, look, you're not putting money into the bank. You're borrowing money from the bank. So don't worry about whether it's going to be there or not.
The other thing I don't think people understand is the bank just creates the money. Money didn't exist before they gave you the loan anyway. They just created it on their balance sheet and poof, there you go. Here's the money.
That's right. And they're going to lend 10x of whatever you deposited. So
yep.
That's their lending.
That's true. You'd have to open a U.S. bank account, right, to receive all of the rents and everything. Is that difficult to do?
Yeah, that's correct. And then for a number of reasons, you're going to have a U.S. bank account, but you can't get the U.S. bank account until you get the EIN. And we can't get the EIN until we get the name approved by the state. So we get the EIN in the right name. So all of this is something we take care of for our foreign clients. We handle all of these bureaucratic steps, drive everybody nuts, including us, because, it's just frustrating to deal with bureaucratic mindsets.
Can you open a bank account without being physically present?
No, not anymore. After the attacks on 9/11, Congress passed the Patriot Act, which requires you to actually be physically present in order to open a bank account. Now, there might be some ways around that. A lot of times, foreign investors have somebody in the U.S. they know, a relative, and we can add them to the structure. They can then go open a bank account for them. And then there are some online banks like Mercury Bank, Wise Bank, Relay Bank, where some people have had some success being able to open some kind of a bank account through these online banks.
Interesting. So they get a vacation and they get to buy property in the U.S.
This just keeps getting better. You should come over anyway. And if you have questions about, where to go and what to see, you can email us. invest@rpcinvest.com. We'll hook you up for sure. There's all kinds of really cool stuff over here to see. Canada's on my list. Bob keeps talking about Canada. I travel all over the place. I really love traveling. Canada's on my list. From what I've seen, it's unbelievably beautiful up there.
Oh, it is. It's an amazing country. The Canadian Rockies are far prettier than the U.S. Rockies, and it's just, I mean, and the whole country is just an amazing place. Yeah.
Well, yeah, the mountain bike trails are out of control up there. So, okay, so start to finish on this process, Bob. Like, generally speaking, how long does this take? So, if one of the folks listening says, "Okay, I knew I could do it. I didn't know how. Now I know how. Now I know who the guy to call." How long does this process take? How long should they expect?
Usually anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks, unless, there's some snafu at the state agency where we're setting up the entities. But we can generally have all the entities set up in 2 to 4 weeks with all the documentation. The one thing that's going to be lacking will be the EIN. And we apply for that right away. If everything works correctly, we can get the EIN within 2 weeks. That's pretty rare that actually happens because it doesn't work correctly. More often, it's 4 to 6 weeks. And sometimes in a worst case scenario, it's 8 or even 10 weeks to do it. So the best thing to do for a potential investor is get started as soon as possible so we can get the EIN applied for. And then when you're finally really ready to start investing or making offers, you're all set and ready to go. No delays.
Yeah, for sure.
So I have one follow-up question on the money stuff. So if I open a US bank account, I live in Canada, I receive rent. How do I get the money? Unless you just, I guess, park it in a US bank account. And I guess maybe the advantages and disadvantages of what you do with the money. Do we transfer it to your Canadian bank? Like, what's the best way to handle the money?
Yeah, it's all electronic transfers and transferred from your US bank account back to your Canadian account. But a lot of Canadians want to leave the money in the US and just recycle the money because they don't want to suffer the exchange rate. It's almost a 30% hit at this point. Of course, it changes all the time, but it can really hurt. So a lot of times you just want to leave the money in the US and keep buying properties with the money.
Okay.
And a lot of different ways they can do that.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. I mean, it sounds like between what you do and what we do, working together to help people be able to acquire properties here sounds pretty
Right.
seamless. That's awesome.
And a lot of Canadians and foreign investors would love just to buy a turnkey property because they don't have to supervise a renovation from far away, which is a little bit tougher to do if you don't know what you're doing.
It's hard enough to do in your local market. I can't imagine trying to do it from out of state or out of country, especially where it's it's a little bit trickier to get here in effect from out of the country. But yeah, for sure.
Just a horror story. I had an experience. I had a client call me the other day, and she lives in Western Ontario, not that far from Detroit. And she said, and Canadians are wonderful people because they're very trusting and very, and people, they're just not like Americans. Let's put it that way, or trying to rip everybody off like Americans do. So anyway, they're very trusting. And this wonderful lady had paid a contractor $65,000 up front to renovate her new property in Detroit.
Oh, no.
And she, called later on and said, he's not answering the phone. I think I'm going to drive over there and see what's going on with my property. And nothing had been done months later. She can't find the guy. He walked off with the money. She said, "What can I do?" And I said, "Really, nothing. You're not going to be able to find it."
Yeah. That's awful.
Yeah. So,
so frustrating.
Whether you are foreign or American, irrelevant, never give somebody upfront the money on a rehab.
Right.
Yeah. Or construction or anything like that where they have to actually produce something. Yeah, don't do that.
But this is where good coaching comes into play because this is why you want to have a good coach on the acquisition side to walk you through and just give you tips like that. You never give money to somebody up front. Yeah. That would have solved that problem.
That's a really good point.
Okay. Any final words of wisdom for our foreign listeners listening to the show?
Well, any words of wisdom would be, don't be afraid to jump into the U.S. market. Let us know if we can help you, and we will. We'll get you protected from U.S. liability, so none of your personal assets in Canada are at risk. We'll make sure that you're going to be tax efficient. We run almost every structure we propose by our Canadian accountants and U.S. accountants to make sure we are dotting the I's and crossing the T's. So, with a group of professionals like we work with, you're going to end up having the best possible structure that is going to put you in the best possible position. And then hopefully you're working with some good coaches in Canada or in a foreign country that are going to help you be able to invest wisely in the States and find some great deals and make a lot of money.
Awesome.
Perfect.
How do people get a hold of you, Bob?
Yeah.
Well, they can contact us at info@assetdefenseteam.com, or they can call our office at 945-542-7738. And we're happy to help if we can. More than happy.
Man,
Super helpful.
Definitely reach out to Bob. And listen, we had Bob on to talk about specifically foreign investing, but the lion's share of his business is stateside, setting up structures for people for asset protection and entity structure, helping guys like me not make mistakes with their entity structure and their asset protection. So, Bob, we appreciate your time, my friend. Thank you for helping us out with this question. Thank you guys so much for listening. And if you love the show, which we know you do, go ahead and subscribe. And the most important thing that you can do to help us out is to leave a review. And we really, really appreciate that. Until next week, get out there and make something happen.
This has been the Get Real Podcast. To subscribe and for more information, including a list of all episodes, go to getrealestatesuccess.com.